Hello, I'm Kathy Obear, and thank you for joining me for Creating Inclusive Organizations Part 2, Strategies to Create Meaningful, Sustainable Systemic Change. I am delighted you're here, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I just want to acknowledge the original custodians of the land where I'm doing this webinar, and that's the Arapaho here in Denver. So the webinar outcomes for today is to identify promising practices, strategic actions that will create inclusive, socially just organizations, really empowering everyone, holding them accountable to do that. To do that, you're going to need critical infrastructure and sustainability structures, accountability structures, so that you really have that systemic change you want. I don't know if this relates to you, but many leaders I'm meeting are feeling the environmental press. Their employees are raising issues and concerns and demands. People in the community and the nation are asking us to live up to the vision and the missions we said we're about. And people are saying our lived realities are very different than what you say we are, and there's this gap. And so in part one, we really focused on using that MCOD, Multicultural Organizational Development Model, the Jackson-Hardiman model, to help leaders empower, mobilize employees to join together to say, where are we? Where do we want to go? What's our vision? And how do we get there? And we left with the question of what do I do? And so that's what we'll be doing today. How to create inclusive organizations, leaders effectively lead and empower to create sustainable change. You have to have authentic conversation to identify the degree of equity now so that you can choose the right infrastructure and the right strategies to move you. Any tool won't do it. You have to know where you are, where you want to go, and progressively move to get there. Because the end goal is to have everyone in the organization empowered, accountable, and skilled up to know it's their job to, in their responsibilities, create equity inclusion in everything they do. So every policy, program, service, every protocol, they know how to analyze with an inclusion lens. They need to have the ongoing support of supervisors and leaders to make those shifts continuous improvement. And so that's what we'll be talking about today. And like all my webinars, I'll share for about 60 minutes some tools and strategies and activities. You can download the handouts. And then if you want something more in depth, you can have people come and join my virtual institute. And that will be May 17th. That's a 3-hour similar material, live engaging workshop that I will lead. And all you need to do is pull people together. So you don't have to be the one leading and dealing with all the resistance. I'll be the one leading the activities, and that can help get many more people in deep conversation about where we are, where we need to go, into the strategies and making some next steps. I'll also be talking about some of the expected resistance you can have and some strategies to engage. If you have a lot more questions, you can always type them in now, and I'll have a much more in-depth Q&A on May 24th. And I'll take all the leftover ones from today and any others people send me in my email, and then people have live, and we'll just stay on and record it until we're done with questions. Because what we've been doing in organizations is necessary, but nowhere near sufficient. And I want to just review the pyramid to remind us all that most people that I meet in all the organizational change work that I do are stuck at the individual level. They're walking on eggshells, so concerned. I don't want to be seen as racist. Don't call me homophobic. I just want to make sure I don't get in trouble. And so they might care about their biases. They might care about exploring them and interrupting them. And so the training that we do often stops at, what is your socialization, what not to say, here are the rules on Title IX, what are oppressive behaviors. And so while that's necessary, it's nowhere near sufficient. We have to get people to the group level. And you notice it's harder to see those. We can notice microaggressions, and my second webinar is on that. And you can skill people up, full breadth of differences, privileged, marginalized. What are the common daily indignities, individual behaviors and policies, practices, climate that really leave people feeling disempowered, undervalued, invisible, not feeling they're a part of the respected environment, not supported to do their best work. And so skilling people up in their privileged identities to recognize them, interrupt them, and hold them accountable for doing that. So you mobilize and empower everybody to be doing that. And people in their marginalized identities to be able to have all the support so that they have the skills and the resources and the supervisors supporting them to also speak truth to power. Most organizations stop there. Very few people, and maybe there are pockets that really get the capacity to look at the climate, the culture, the policies and practices with a social justice lens, and how the mission, the vision, the values all intersect with the dominant culture, written rules, unwritten rules, all the norms, the hidden curriculum, as people are calling it now, That's what we have to skill people up at the organizational level. If you notice, you don't get to see many of those cubes in the organizational level. A lot of it is out of our view. And so it's going to take a lot of work, and that's what we'll be focusing on today a lot in part 2. You need to create the vision. You have to assess where you are and have a shared understanding, identify the gap, and then persistently build to create change. And that takes a lot of work. Organizational change is persistence, long-term change effort. And it helped me to frame this with the LCY cross model, and this is on page 9 of your packet. I mentioned this last time because we really worked on phase 1 in part 1 of this webinar series. The 3 phases of inclusion, institutional change. So the first one is to increase awareness and commitment of top leaders, managers, and many people in the organization. What is the current dynamics? So they have the passion to be in it for the long haul and have a commitment to do their part. I won't say it's the easier, but in some ways, that's what most people do and they know how to do. What's more difficult is the building internal capacity, which we'll focus on today. And so phase 2, that is the capacity of leaders, not only to be aware and they know it's their job, but how do they lead? How do they work within a division or the entire organization to mobilize everyone and create the infrastructure? The managers and supervisors need to be skilled up into the next level of training and development. Your change agents have to be mobilized into infrastructure so they are really helping the leaders move and accelerate change. And every member of the organization has to have at least a foundational level of understanding. And I'll talk about what I believe that needs to be. Now, phase 3 is built on phase 2 because now folks are ready, at least more ready, to assume their responsibility to infuse equity inclusion into everything they do. And you skill them up, but you've got to hold them accountable. I bet 90% of the organizations, if not 95, I get to have a very weak accountability structure. Just general performance management is not done. And so when I ask about how are you holding people accountable to equity, inclusion, social justice outcomes, they look at me like I'm talking a language they don't understand because they don't understand accountability. People are afraid of conflict. They don't want to be held accountable themselves maybe, and so they don't hold others. It is so critical that we infuse it into an accountability structure, and I'll highlight some tools and skills today. And so the Jackson-Hardiman MCOD model on page 11 and 12, you can see the indicators that we worked on in part 1. We have to have that shared diagnosis. We have to have authentic dialogue. People have to have the capacity to be engaged in difficult conversations, respectful disagreement, use each other's perspectives so that we have more of a consensus. I'm not saying agreement on everything, but we're moving in this direction and we're always listening to people, including folks that are naysayers or way back behind where the organization is. We have to continue to have conversations with everyone so that we identify the strategic actions that are needed to accelerate movement. Now, on page 20, I found it helpful that this list of good basic strategic actions you need to do wherever you are in that model, whether you're at exclusionary or the club, these are still good ideas. If you're at 4 affirming, they'll have a different role, but most people, wherever they are, these are not bad places to start. And no matter where you are, you need to get a lot of folks involved in doing these. So I'm going to highlight them real quickly, and then I'm going to tell you the traps of each one of these. You may want to keep page 20 in front of you and just take notes on the traps. You've got to gain leadership commitment, and that's what phase 1 is all about, and get their support and ownership and development. It can't be that they just sit back and get out of the way. They have to understand why, and they have to lead. There has to be an inclusion change team, at least at the systems level, if not at the different unit level, which I'll talk about later. And that group has to then partner with the top leaders and form a leadership. It's really like they're all leaders now, to assess the current state, to really look at that data, identify next steps, and collaboratively implement. And too often leaders will abdicate their responsibility. Once they hire a senior diversity officer, they get inclusion change teams, they think, okay, they're doing it, I now get back to business. Equity inclusion is the business of the organization. As we talked about in part 1, clarifying the vision and the end state, to create an inclusive, socially just organization. This helps the system get ready. It's not just 5 people in a room. You empower everybody, get all their voices together collectively to clarify what is our vision, where are we going, what does diversity mean to us, what does social justice mean. While all that is going on, You can also be making plan either through HR or other leaders. How do we conduct a comprehensive cultural audit? Some people might call it a survey. But it's more than that. So it's not only getting satisfaction data from your customers and all of your employees and disaggregate that by group membership. You're also looking at usage. You're also looking at policies, programs, and services to get a deep understanding, in addition, of what are the common privileged and marginalized group dynamics. Now, in many surveys, and I've read many in my 35 years doing organizational change and diversity work, the surveys often seem to skim. And so you might also want to use focus groups at this point to really get a deeper understanding and do it by affinity identity. The other part of number 4 is to get many people involved in mapping out not only the current dynamics, but the policies, practices, structures. Now, you notice I say that over and over. When you can say it without thinking, then you know you're probably ready to lead other people to doing it. You have to know what you currently are doing: hiring, onboarding, performance management, basic supervision strategies, coaching strategies, how you're doing budgets. Every practice, HR and leadership practice, needs to be analyzed with an inclusion lens, because most likely it's advantaging some and clearly disadvantaging others. And then you're ready to look for promising practices, because then you've kind of got the gap. And so you start benchmarking, and you may want to start benchmarking in your organization. Who's doing what in an organization already? Because usually, even in a stage 3 compliance, there are pockets of 4. And even in a club, there are pockets of 3. So find what you're doing, but really you'll probably have to go outside, unless you're a 4+, almost a 5. But even then, finding organizations that are farther along and what they're doing, and bring literally 8, 10, 15 examples of each type of policy, practice, structure you're looking for, because then you can create your own that's really aligned with what your needs are and where you want to go. It's tailor-made. At this point, the leaders and inclusion change team, and at this point they may have implementation teams, but maybe not quite yet, are analyzing the data. But again, you want to get a lot of people involved in that. So you may have analyzing the data, somebody looking at professional development, somebody looking at workplace climate, somebody might be looking at hiring, retention, recruitment, and they look at the data through those different lenses. Deep understanding of that, of what your readiness is and where you need to go. And then you need to be able to then implement strategic activities. So out of the analyzing the data, you look at what strategic activities will help close the gap, get everybody's voice in where you think we could go, get your community partners, maybe some best practice partners that you've been working with in other organizations, and have them offer all kinds of ideas. Distill those down into a strategic plan, and then figure out how you want to implement them. And that's when those analyzing data teams could turn into implementation teams. But often people have different skills, so you may want to still have more people come in who are doers and can get things done. That's what you really need now. Implement, and then you evaluate. Ongoing, always evaluation, and analyze more and more data, revise, keep going. Now, it sounds a lot easier than it is. You've got these 8 steps. It's a long-term process, but you're building capacity. The folks that are involved in this can then do it when they're in unit change teams, or the individual leaders and supervisors, individual contributors. So it's all professional development. You have to remember that, because your naysayers will start saying it's taken a lot of time and it's taking people away from real work. You're really empowering people and skilling them up for this process, that they'll be able to have transferable skills to many other things. But the potholes, I went too far. See, that's what we do. We skip the potholes. We just keep moving through and end up swirling and stuck in them. When you're trying to get leader buy-in, going too fast is what I used to do. When I was in organizations, even as an early consultant, I would be like, I know what you need to do. Let's just do what I'll tell you. But I didn't have buy-in, and that happens in most every organization. You get 1 or 2 champions, and they try to push, instead of leadership retreats, instead of getting opportunities to have people talk about their concerns, engaging the resistance strategically. You have to have the leader's commitment and buy-in, so that they'll allocate resources. They won't undermine people that are some of the leaders that are doing this work. The other next step, the inclusion change team, is to jump in too quickly to tasks. Like, oh, we're so far behind, we have to hurry up. And you don't form the inclusion change team. You don't do the development that's needed. They need the skills to have authentic dialogue, analyze data, deal with conflict, navigate difficult situations, know when they're triggered. recognize privileged, marginalized group dynamics in the moment. They need to be almost the future of the organization. So they need the skills to practice all the time that they want the whole organization to be able to do, and you need to invest in their development. People may say it'll take too long. The upfront investment will pay dividends as they're not getting stuck and lost and people dropping off and dropping out. When you're moving to try to clarify the vision and the end state and what social justice, equity, inclusion mean, the trap here is assume silence or nodding means agreement. And so you know these folk, whoever you're working with, and you probably know who is not quite where you want them to be or on board to really be a champion. And so building one-on-one relationships, having enough conversations in groups, inviting the resistance, inviting the disagreement so that you get the feedback early and you can discuss it and see if there are ideas. Often where people disagree, there's some great ideas. And you see me moving like this because that's what it is at this point, trying to have a shared understanding. It does take time, but you're building relationships with people who might have been, if you don't do this, they will be the ones that will throw this way off track. And they're just sitting back waiting, arms crossed, until another crisis happens or another issue comes up and they say, see, look at all this time we wasted. We have to get back to real work. But if you can work with them to get closer on board, help them develop, to be more aware of these issues, that they're an important part of the process, that will be critical. Number 4, if you hoard the data, if you keep it holding up the shelves, or if only a few people look at it, you need to share this data widely, whether it's open forum, whether it's focus groups. You bring the focus groups back together to look at not only what they said, but what everybody has said. Again, no names, you get the themes. And then you ask, what are some strategies? What could we do to move forward? You get each department to do it. So every leader does it with their leadership teams, and maybe the next level, have them do it with their next couple levels. They engage in open dialogue. Here's what we saw. What do you have? Other data that relates to this? Anything else we missed? And you want to share it in your foundational equity inclusion trainings that you need everybody to be having, because you could start having those happen right now, maybe. And teach them how to analyze data as part of it, and then have them reflect and react to the data. Now, particularly if you've got some examples of when people said these are microaggressions, these are common dynamics, you can use those stories of exclusion and collect examples in your data about inclusion. When did I feel valued? When did I feel that I could do and be my best self? Bring my full identities here. Now, I'm talking identities, not attitudes and opinions about I think racism is okay, I think sexism is okay. That's not what we're talking about. You're bringing your group identities, and so you can be yourself here within the behavior expectations of the organization. So at 5, when you're mapping out all the policies and practices, looking at all the current dynamics, to go it alone, to get a few people doing it, because it's a pretty advanced skill. So you will need to teach many more people how to map out the hiring practices. How do you map out onboarding practices? Get them involved at the local level doing it, collect up current practices so that you know what it looks like. And then you can say, what else do we need? By now, people are going to feel tired, and they're going to be saying, just fix it. Your top leaders, and to be honest, your inclusion change team, some of them may be ready to roll off because they were great at collecting data, but they're in striding a strategic plan, but they may not be great at implementation. So it can be an ongoing shifting of responsibility. The leaders are still there, and they need to now shift their responsibility. But just fix it. Oh no, we're still involved. We're not just dumping this off, abdicating it to anybody else. And so to be able to talk about the predictable feelings of fatigue and impatience and irritation and frustration and just overwhelm, and to be able to talk about self-care and community care, because you just can't make it go away. There are strategies you can use with all these different leadership groups. And the dominant culture is going to be like, fix it now, and to remind people it's a long-term culture change, but we get more and more people involved through training and accountability and some other infrastructures I'll talk about next. It's got to be a collaborative, inclusive process. And the time you take now is a change management strategy to engage any resistance that might be there. I'm not saying you won't have resistance later, but engage as much as you can, because you have the early adapters, but you have to work to get that malleable middle, and maybe some of the naysayers. So you can tolerate some, but you may want to get a few so that they're really engaged in this process. You fix it, number 7. At this point, once the plan is written and the implementation teams are set up, people are like, just do it. But the implementation teams are only there for systemic high level. Every division, every department needs to be doing implementation of the strategic plan with inclusion change teams, and we'll talk about that. And so not just because you have a senior diversity officer, diversity council, unit change teams, everybody's got to get involved. And the final one, all right, here's the annual report, the strategic plan. We did the annual report. It's what you asked for. We're done. No, it's a continuous, multi-year, 7 to 10 year ongoing process, continuous improvement, bringing new people on, training them up. And then one final trap, it should go the other way. I don't know why it's going backwards. So, is to leave all of these strategic plans right next to the surveys and cultural audits on the shelf. And you just keep surveying, doing focus groups, but not having meaningful change. If you don't this time do meaningful, sustainable, systemic change, it may take 5, 10, 15 years before your organization will believe you might be ready to do it again. Now I'm going to start having you look at materials that are some strategic actions. If you know where you are on the MCOD stage, then you can figure out, at least at the next layer, you've got the strategic ideas you want to do. Now what do you do? How do you facilitate movement? And it can be very easy to feel overwhelmed. So I love the strategy by Robert Gass. I got this idea from Dr. Tanya Williams. You may have heard me talk about her. She went, studied with him in a week-long workshop. And it helps me not feel so overwhelmed to organize all the strategies you'll look at into 3 buckets. And Robert Gass, and you can go to his website, I understand he's got a lot of other free resources. Hearts and mind, and that's actually a lot of phase 1 in that LCY Cross model we've talked about. What's the vision, our mission? You get a shared diagnosis of the current state, people's emotions as they look at the gap, all the privileged dynamics, behaviors, and the dominant culture that really impacts people negatively in their marginalized identities, how people go after the few change agents you have to try to undermine them. So be able to talk about that, engage dialogue, get an understanding of the data, real stories, and a lot of employee basic foundational. Now I say basic, I'm not talking diversity 101 only, I'm talking foundational, I'll talk in a moment, to increase their awareness and skills. So that's hearts and minds, because that foundational training is to open up people's hearts and minds about where we need to go. Also in some of this initial training and hearts and minds works, you also want to be doing behavior change and getting people to begin to talk about what are our norms that we want for this new culture. How do we want people engaging? What is respectful engagement? What is disrespectful engagement? What is bullying? And having people talk about that. What we don't want to have, we'll no longer tolerate. And this is where also you look at the practices, as I mentioned earlier, the programs, the services with an inclusion lens and some structures to do that, to skill everybody up, several layers of training, ongoing development. And then systemic change, where, as I mentioned, the structures and strategies, you've skilled people up in behavior change, and now they're going to do it in the systemic change. They're already analyzed them, and now they're actually making the changes, implementing, and they all connect with each other. It's just ongoing. Now, you got to know where you are so that you know what strategies you need. So if you remember from part 1, where did you think you were? And if you don't remember, you may want to start around club and compliance in this next activity. And I'm not going to give you much time, but there are a lot of strategies you can use. And what I did is I took the wonderful work of Jackson Hardiman's model, and then I said, so if someone's at stage 2, how do they get to stage 3? If they're at 3, how do they get to 4? And so if you're at 4, how do you move on to 5? And the units or maybe whole organizations that are exclusionary, what do they need to do so that they really move quickly to get rid of all of that harassment and discrimination that's happening blatantly in the organization? And so if you please turn to pages 21 to 25, and you can decide which one you might want to just glance at for a moment. But the idea is when you go take this back, you can do it with your leaders, you can do it with the inclusion change team, to have them first do all the activities of part 1, and then where I left you off was in a horseshoe, you might remember. They were already moving towards where do we think we are, and authentic dialogue and engaged conversation about where we are. And don't do that too quickly. Good half hour to an hour, just engage and hear each other and ask questions. And then coagulate people up. If they think they're at 1, get them together, 2s, 3s, 4s. And then have them individually first look at the page and the document of these are strategic actions. They're still pretty high level, but these are the kinds of activities and infrastructure that can help you move. Have them look at it, and what they're doing is they're asking the questions, what's already in place, put a check mark, what's in the planning stages we're kind of thinking about, not ready to implement, but we're talking about it, put a dash, this reinforces forward momentum. It's kind of a strength-based approach. I don't ask what you need to be doing. I said, what are you already doing? What are you planning? And what are good next steps that can help you? This is all about change management. Star those. Give them a good 5 minutes to look at this. But they might need more time because most folks overestimate where they think they are. And so you say something like, if you find you don't have a lot of check marks, then just go back one. Don't say you've overdone it, though I sometimes say you might. And have them go back one stage before. And generally I even say, even if you're like, whoo, we've done a lot of these, go back one, because the document I developed, I did work with Dr. Bailey Jackson, one of the authors of the model, to move some things around, and he added some of the top work in each one. But it hasn't necessarily been quantifiably researched. So there could be some, the one before, the one after, that you think, whoo, we're ready for those. Have them do that, talk in their small groups about what they're already doing, what they think you can do. If people think they overestimated, they can move back. If they thought they were a 4, I was just with an organization this week. A lot of the top leaders said, yep, we're 4 affirming. And so I had them do this activity. And then one said, I'm actually back in stage 2 club, and we haven't done many of these strategic actions. So again, you can believe you're somewhere and you might feel it yourself, but until you really look at the structures you're implementing, you might be leaving a lot of people behind. In the small groups, impact of discussing this, what seems reasonable, possible, and what structures are already in place to facilitate our moving. Again, a strength-based approach. What's already here that we can build on? Have them talk about that, then come back to the large group, and each group shares from the different perspectives. You might find you're not that far off. When I do a full day work around MCOD with groups, this is early afternoon, we're at this place. Most groups, when they did the horseshoe and they went to move and where they thought they were, most folks are 2, 3, maybe early 4. You'll have a few outliers at 5, maybe, but they don't stay there long when they read this document. After this reading of the document, you might have more folks in club, and sometimes people move to exclusion. But the group has more capacity now to talk honestly about where we think we are and where we need to go. And there's a lot more humility of, ooh, I thought we were a lot farther on. At this point, I hope they begin to realize that shifts can happen, but they're the key to change. And they have to really work internally with people. The tools and activities we've shared so far, getting each unit and division skilled up in this model so they can assess in their area, begin to look at these same strategies, strategic actions, what we can do, and have that honest conversation about where we are. Now, at this point, people are going to feel overwhelmed and like, okay, we know where we are, we know what we need to be doing, but we're exhausted, we have a full-time job, what do we do? And so you have to build internal capacity. Yes, you're doing the diversity training, but you have to build even more. And you may want to do this activity before you have people out there doing training around equity and inclusion, because you have to first decide where are the leaders, managers, supervisors, other staff, our boards, our volunteers, where are they in their capacities? And if you want to look at pages 4 to 8, we're going to move in that direction. These are many of the skills and capacities that I train leaders, and I'll talk about inclusion practitioners in a moment. Change agents, what they need to be able to do to create and maintain inclusive programs and services. So you don't have to look at this document first. You can just have these same people, 0 not at all, 10 completely, and have them begin to reflect, where do I think our organization, not organization, but our individuals are? And so where are we? How can they create, reinforce inclusive work environments? Can they do it? Are they kind of low, maybe a 3 skilled, or do we have mostly all leaders are 8, 9, and 10 because I see them doing it? Most folks, I think, will come around 1, 2, 3, and 4, very low skilled. And so you might want to assess yourself individually as a change agent and begin to look at what your capacities are. But what's most important is you're rating everybody and having them maybe rate themselves. You can put this into an assessment and a survey, or have all your leaders assess it. What you're really trying to build momentum to is we need much more training. And what we really need is strong foundational equity inclusion training. And there's going to be several layers of this. And let me highlight a few. You have to be able to identify the leadership case. Some people call it the business case, and that might be the big why that's getting talked about more. And that might be the changing demographics. It may be it's a moral imperative. It might be we say this in our mission and we have to fulfill what we say we do here in this region, in this community. We care about our reputation. We want to recruit, retain, hold on to the talent we have and bring in more, and we need a much better reputation to do that, and our customers. We have to serve them effectively. We need to keep an ongoing flow of customers. And so we need a good reputation. And that leads to financial viability. Given the economy in the last year since the recession and what's going on recently, many organizations are finding that they have to stay financially viable. So whatever the self-interest of your leaders are, build a business case. And don't tell them, but ask them why. They have to find a compelling reason, compelling business leadership case that wants them to move forward and stay in this for the long haul. When you're doing foundational training with leaders and everyone else in the organization, I believe they have to recognize the full breadth of differences. I do believe you need to go in depth on many topics of diversity. And if you do that first, the people in the privileged identity will just move farther into resistance and to stuckness. So I strategically learned this over 35 years. I do breadth of differences. We let people just really map out who we're serving, who we are, who I am, and engage in an authentic dialogue about the dynamics in the organization, inclusion and exclusion. And in June and July, I'll share some of my favorite activities that I do to do this. But you have to get people understanding privilege and marginalized groups, and then common dynamics, and then how those are showing up in our organization. They have to know their full breadth of privileged, marginalized group identities. It can't be I'm helping others. It's like, ooh, what are my identities? How do I get seen and treated based on those? And how might my own identities impact what I notice and what I don't notice? You have to skill them up to recognize those microaggressions in the moment, whether they're individual behaviors or policies and practices. And then you have to be able to interrupt those. And that's the skill development of a solid foundational day. When I have a full 8 hours, I can squeeze in a couple other things, but usually it's just next steps are raising awareness and commitment to creating change. This is a phase 1 intervention. Now, you can do this for everybody, but I find often you want to then take your change agents and your leaders and help them go to the next layer. And so this could be your managers, supervisors, inclusion practitioners, facilitators, to be able to navigate difficult conversations and situations. Because as you move into phase 2, as you move into trying to build an internal capacity, people are going to start resisting and they're going to say, yeah, but this doesn't really happen, or you're making a big deal. You have to engage those conversations effectively without judgment, shame. You need to be able to explore the resistance. Another next level is the common privileged behaviors. And I believe I included this handout in my microaggression workshop. I definitely will in June and July materials. I started this looking at whites, all the work that I've done on working with whites to dismantle the internalized dominance, how's that for jargon, but these racist beliefs, these white supremacist beliefs that we have, that whites are smarter, whites are better. And out of those react in ways and treat folks of color, treat other whites in ways that perpetuates organizations, policies, cultures that keeps whites comfortable, successful, and creates incredible barriers for folks of color. So I've identified, I think, 41 common privileged attitudes and behaviors that when we're unaware, we're acting on all the time. And that builds on the work from the microaggression workshop that I did that you all can get access to. That the common unproductive behaviors that happen in meetings, but it takes it a step level to say, when whites are constantly interrupting people of color, they're not just interrupting everybody. They're going to be folks of color, most likely out of an attitude of whites are smarter, better, folks of color defective, and it sounds disgusting in my body to say it, but if we don't name the racist dynamics and behaviors that are fueling racist behaviors in our organizations, then we can't recognize them and we just say, oh, they're having a bad day or you're just too sensitive. No, we need to really look at privileged behavior. So this is the next step work. Helping people, like then I've mentioned, analyze policies, programs, practicing it, using the group identity cards, which are at the back of your packet, and really doing it 10, 15, 20 times so that they can do it in their sleep almost. And then training these leaders, not only big L leaders who have positional power, but your change agents to lead meaningful organizational change because they've got to do it in their area. So you'll have the department leader, you might have a supervisor, but they also want other change agents to help them out. And so this is some of the next step training you need to do. What I want to do next is talk about the infrastructure to develop and sustain this internal capacity. And I'll talk about 5 areas. The first will be what you might already have is a cadre of trainers and facilitators, but I have a few more ideas you may or may not have considered. The one that I think is critical is inclusion practitioners embedded in every unit, every department, every division, partnering with the leaders. Unit change teams, I'll talk about some strategy to do both of those. Clear expectations, I'll show you some tools how to do that. And finally, some ideas on comprehensive professional development programs and what you need to do to develop those ongoing development. All right, here we go. So most places have a train the trainer, train the facilitator. It's often informal or may come from the grassroots. What I'm suggesting is top leaders and inclusion change teams really think about what are the expected core competencies we want all leaders to have, all employees to have, and then therefore, what kinds of workshops do we need? You need to assess what you currently have, what kind of workshops are happening, what kind of competency level do people have, or you could skip that part if you just know in your gut they just need this good foundational work. But the top leaders not only need to endorse it, but they need to be the ones that are championing and an advisor or two so that the folks that are leading and doing the train the trainer have someone they can go to pretty quickly if they need more resources or they're getting some backlash from this area. Once you know what the curriculum is, once you know what the competencies are you want to do, then you can build the curriculum. I don't recommend people take something right off the shelf or your favorite activities. It has to be really grounded in strategic plan. Therefore, what competencies do people need? What outcomes do you want them to do? Therefore, what curriculum? And you want to look at your HR organization to see what they're already doing, your training development if you're big enough. Most likely you have trainers there, and most likely they're doing pretty good workshops in general, but they may not be infusing equity, inclusion, and social justice skills and competencies and results in their supervision training, their how do you do customer service training. So the first step would be to look at all those trainings. How do we infuse these same competencies in so that people are getting them several places? And then I believe you always will need some standalone work around equity, inclusion, social justice. So you can build the curricula and the workshop design, and then you build the train the trainer because you have to have people who can then train that curriculum. Some places I've worked with wanted to just build trainers and to have the capacity to facilitate in general. And then I gave them a whole bunch of training activities and they pieced things together because they had design skills and facilitation skills. That's another way to go. Lately, the places I've been working have wanted a set kind of curriculum that I've actually helped them develop. And then we trained people to be able to do that. However, even after the initial training, they need ongoing work. But how do you get the trainers? An application process, a nomination process. Be really clear what competencies and life experiences you want them to have. Do you want them to come in with a moderate degree of presentation skills, a moderate degree of facilitation skills already, and they're just learning the equity inclusion, or do you want them to have a good, moderate, deep understanding, again, all those 64 capacities for inclusion practitioners, those kind of skills and knowledge you want them to have. So just get clear what you're looking for and then build an application nomination process towards that. With selection, make sure you have very clear criteria for that. And then I like to have one per division at least, if not one per department. And if you do a group for 12 months, you could bring in a second group. And so over several years, you're really building incredible internal capacity. Not only do you want to bring in folks with key competencies, you also want to look at group memberships. And so to have a nice, rich balance among race, age, disability status, gender identity, sex, nationality, etc., sexuality, immigration status, religion, spirituality. Again, you may not get a full group of privileged marginalized on every identity that is represented in the organization, but get as broad a representation as you can, while you also are getting people that are motivated, willing, they understand their commitment, and they are just excited about being a part of this organizational change. Initial training, several days, and you can spread it out a bit, but they're going to need the foundational training, the next step training that I already mentioned, as well as some in-depth work. And so they'll need to have some in-depth work around racism, around sexism, around sexuality, heterosexism, around classism, and any other ism that is up and a pain point for your organization. Don't have to get that all in the first few sessions, but ongoing training. So they're deepening their capacity in all the skills in that inclusion practitioner self-assessment, in addition to facilitation and design. I like to get them, let's say you have 15, 20 of them, 30. I like to have them in core groups so they're getting to know each other, maybe 5 or 6 in a core group, and they're working together as they're in these trainings. But then that works outside of the formal trainings. They get together and they do practice and feedback. So you have the curriculum, They actually then do an activity, co-led or by themselves. They get feedback, and then someone else does an activity. So once a month for a couple hours, or twice a month for 90 minutes, something like that. And maybe one person comes, does an activity, they all give feedback, and then other people practice it. They have to keep practicing to get the capacity before you put them up in front of people. Now, your organization may have some people that are all ready to be trainers. They've been doing it, and all they need is the curriculum you want to do. Then you may want to have them be the lead trainers. Have them be the ones that are out front first. Then you have a co-lead who is almost ready, so they get to do a couple of easier activities, or maybe just introduce and give the task, whereas the lead does the debrief, which is often where people will be triggered or have difficult conversations. And then have a couple observers. So when you're actually rolling it out, you can still have a scaffolding of who's got what responsibility based on their competencies and their experience and their confidence. Have people in the room giving them feedback afterwards, and or just videotape them all and say to the participants, the participants may not like this, so you have to juggle that, but say, we're just keeping it right on the facilitators because we're just rolling this out. This is part of their development. And then have them sit down with their core group and watch it on them sit by themselves as well as with the whole group. Clearly, you need an accountability recognition process. Unless you have full-time, full paid people doing training facilitation, this is on top of other work. Now, I know that as they become trainers, they will get all these different capacities of equity inclusion that they'll bring into every meeting, every task force, into their supervision, into the product development, into customer service. So they're deepening their capacity, they're helping their career development, and it's going to be 10 to 20% of their time, most likely, especially in different times of the year. And so making sure that their manager, supervisor, all the way up to VP knows this is happening. They're getting recognition, letters in their folder. Their supervisor knows that they're expected to support this because it's a university or organization-wide investment. And you want to think probably of some kind of supervision accountability structure, whether it's their supervisor or someone out of HR. You need somebody coordinating it, so they need some type of line of supervision that goes into the performance appraisal, just in case a small percentage do not follow through, that it's a part of their job. You need an accountability process. Some organizations I've worked with have done extra compensation. Now that can be in the form of an extra $1,000 or a couple $1,000 for the year to go to more conferences. It can be in the form of you get more professional development monies to do your own development virtually and or locally, go to a workshop. And I have worked with some organizations that were able to find a way to pay each person $150 more money for every workshop they did. These were all universities, by the way, or nonprofits. So compensation some way, yes, it's their job description. They change the job description to recognize it. Have them all meet with the president and the vice presidents twice a year to just give informal feedback. And what are you noticing in an organization? What recommendations do you have? That kind of networking, the chance for even a mentorship. So think of ways to compensate, because you will really be working them and using them, and they deserve to have some type of way to know that they're valued and they're getting something in return. Now I want to talk about inclusion practitioners in depth. This model I learned with Elsie Cross Associates. They had diversity practitioners in a number of different corporations. I was with their Wachovia group. We worked with several years, and these were folk. At the time, I believe all of them were already in HR in some type of organizational development or training role, and they were already assigned to different divisions. And then on top of that, they infused equity, inclusion, social justice as a part of how they did organizational development training. And this blew me away. They had 40 days of in-depth training to be incredible facilitators and inclusion practitioners. While I was still working with LCY Cross, that cut back to 20. When I'm working with organizations over a year, it may add up to 10 to 12. The initial training can be 2 or 3, 4, and then lots of ongoing. But let me get clear what their role is. In addition to helping lead group discussions, this is different than facilitators. These are internal change agents. These are organizational development change agents who partner with the leader of the organization to think about what's our current state. How do we have our entire staff look at what their professional development needs and get those done? How do we look at our customer service and analyze our policies and practices? It's not somebody to do all that. It's someone to partner with the senior leader to think about how to get everybody up to speed and doing it. And the reason I think it's a critical role is leaders are so pulled in so many competing directions, increasingly so, in my opinion, at least in my experience. And so to have a subject matter expert, SME, some organizations call them that, a key subject matter expert that's got growing, expanding depth around equity, inclusion, social justice, and change management, that can partner with the leader to help the leader do their job. I want to be clear, it's not the inclusion practitioner's job, it's the leader's job to lead in their area. That's why you want one per department, one per unit at least. And the self-assessment can help the leader and the inclusion practitioner look at their current capacity, see where their gaps are, and that might help the inclusion practitioner maybe fast track some capacity. For instance, discretionary points mapping that I talked about on the previous workshop, I believe. Or maybe it's coming up. Maybe they don't, the leader's really good at data analysis, but the inclusion practitioner isn't, so they can learn that, but they really have to learn how to navigate difficult situations because the leadership doesn't know. So they can work together to figure out how do they both keep learning and then complement while they also learn the other skills. Ongoing development, cross-unit happens. So these inclusion practitioners, after the initial in-depth training, come back together at least monthly, where they get ongoing. You can do the inclusion practitioner assessment, self-assessment. Everyone takes it. If you have 20, 30, 40 of these folks, just get a gap analysis and then prioritize which skills you want to teach in what order or what the organization needs. If the whole organization needs to be doing process mapping, you would teach that first. If they need to be doing hiring particularly differently, you might teach that. And then folks can then go back, work with their leaders to implement at the local level. Cross-unit sharing. You also want at these meetings for people to say, in addition to mapping, we also just did a whole workshop around hierarchical and class and got incredible honest conversation about microaggressions that were happening. Here is the workshop and the PowerPoint. Who wants it? And what do you have to give back? And so it's a real sharing. And the other part is accountability, is if every month they're having to come and say, here's what we're working on, here's what we're planning, here's what did not go so well, help me out here, get group coaching. It'll build a community of learners plus an accountability structure. Now, one more thing about reverse mentoring. When the inclusion practitioner is working with a senior leader, not often, but sometimes they will have more marginalized identities than the senior leader, and it can feel like emotional labor. It can feel like I'm doing a lot of teaching and training. And so to really negotiate from the beginning, I learned this again at Wachovia, reverse mentoring. There was one organization, it was an LGBT affinity group, that intentionally found senior leaders and said, we will willingly work with you as it's not quite a peer mentor, but we'll help you learn about LGBT issues, how to be a leader around these issues, and really build a relationship, because they were all LGBT identified, and the senior leaders, 201, were all heterosexual identified, cisgender to my knowledge. They then learned, and in return, their reverse mentoring was any kind of questions they had about what does it take to be successful, career development, introduce them to other people that would be useful in their own career and professional development. So it was a wonderful relationship that everybody learned, filled some skill gaps, professional development, friendships grew. And the folks who are in the marginalized identities, often in these inclusion practitioner roles, got lots of support and compensation for all the extra work they were doing in the reverse mentoring. Here's some of the roles you can have in your organization. So in addition to partnering with the top leader to really plan what they're doing in their department, they'll be in all kinds of staff meetings, department meetings, on search committees, where they will have much more of a depth of capacity to recognize microaggressions, recognize decisions that are about to go wrong, and can intervene in ways that can help the whole group be much more productive. They also will be informal coaching with peers, because people will start to see how more successful they are. And so they'll say, what did you learn? So they can share resources, books, go to lunch, teach them the same skills they're learning. You could also have them do peer coaching in a formal way. Maybe it's once a month over lunch, or 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and you come together and it's an intentional curriculum where they're sharing, whoever wants to be there, because all these skills will help people in their career development and their promotional opportunities. Those that recognize that will want to learn it. They may not be yet ready to be an inclusion practitioner, or you want to start with just a certain number, but start doing this peer coaching and then start noticing who's interested, and that can be your next layer of inclusion practitioners that next year. Maybe you do it every 6 months. And finally, if you do large group events, open forums, big training, professional developments, you can use them as small group facilitators. You have your trainers, but you also have them as small group facilitators. So inclusion practitioners are a significant infrastructure that will help you accelerate and advance your achieving your your strategic plan much more quickly, and get social justice, equity, inclusion embedded into the day-to-day at phase 3, getting many more people skilled up much more quickly. So unit change teams, like a system-wide change team, and it could be at the department, division, or even at a smaller unit, and it can be 5 people, it can be 15. I don't like much more than that. But again, they partner with a leader, and then if you have inclusion practitioners, to do everything from analyzing data to analyzing practices and services. So they're trying to achieve the diversity goals for the whole organization, and they're connected to the organizational-wide inclusion change team. I like to have it that the 2 leaders of the unit change team also belong to the system-wide change team, but that is a lot of time for them. So maybe you have co-leaders, one belongs to the system-wide and the other one coordinates the meeting locally. So they come together and work together, but they don't have to attend everybody's meeting. Have to do team development with them with an equity inclusion lens, again, similar skills I've been naming. Teach them how to revise data, policies and practices, and then decide how to plan professional development. Now, they may not do the professional development, but they have to figure out how to have that happen, maybe with the inclusion practitioner. Speaking of professional development, I've had organizations take my self-assessment for inclusion practitioners, maybe not all 64 items, but choose the 20 to 40 capacities that you want everyone to have, send it out anonymously, have people take it, assess where the gaps are, where the strengths are, and then decide how they want to move forward. Now, generally, everybody needs foundations, even if they say they know more. I would do everyone through that. But then leadership executive development can be based on some assessment, and that needs to be ongoing, not just 2 hours, not just once a year, building into their regular meetings as well. I already mentioned the next level. Now, these deep dives, because I like to do breadth of differences first, that does privilege marginalized, so everybody looks at their whole identities. Then the next ones could be these deep dives, and I got this name from Case Western Reserve University. You could do a whole, I was about to say a whole day. Some organizations can do that, some won't, but maybe 2 half days on race and racism, 2 half days on disability oppression, on religion, spirituality, and go all the different topics of diversity, and over a year offer maybe 8 to 10, and then put in the performance appraisal, you have to attend 4 out of those 10. Wouldn't that be exciting? You also need to do development with leaders and all change agents and wannabe change agents on how do you create change. And I mentioned some of this before, MCOD, change management, dealing with difficult situations. And then the last area about how to do comprehensive development programs is do some training and development on how do you develop high-performing teams. And that could be leaders and inclusion practitioners, several layers of leaders in the division with inclusion practitioner, and it can also be training people to come in and do organizational climate assessment at a unit level, develop reports, share that back, and do live conflict discussions, mediation. It is super advanced, but you might have some people in your organizational development or HR areas. You can bring in consultants, but you need the capacity somewhere to have teams be able to look at their effectiveness around equity, inclusion, group dynamics, and how to move forward, and to be able to move through and back and forth and analyze and discuss old issues that are still stuck in. Very advanced, but it's very critical. And then finally, the infrastructure you need is clarifying clear expectations and accountability. I'm adding that to most of the workshops I'm doing these days. And you may have seen it in some of my earlier. Getting everybody, all the leaders, to clarify competencies, what we want, full organization conversation. So we develop principles of community, Then you infuse that in all HR practices, leadership practices. Train your supervisors and managers to coach people to them, including coaching people out if they don't move quickly into these. You'll need a incident reporting structure, bias response, grievance. So if the problem is your managers and supervisors, they have a way to report. Often HR is not the place. People don't trust it. I'm not saying HR is incompetent, but every campus I get to, every organization, most people say, I don't trust HR. So you might need a separate new system that people might begin to trust, Ombud system. And then you develop these expectations, send them out for feedback one last time, and then you implement them and revise them. It's a living document. And so this is the way I like to encourage you to do that. You're identifying the expectations. You can get everybody in a room, all at a table with a sheet of paper on the left side. How do we want to engage, treat each other? What are our expectations? So we have inclusive, high-producing, really effective teams. Draw a line down the middle, the other side, behaviors that cross a line. Give them 5 to 10 minutes, depending upon how much time you have, to brainstorm and chart. I say discuss, but not get deep in the weeds of arguing. So discuss a little bit, but chart. Try to get 5 to 10 on each side. When it feels like people have had a chance to have that conversation, then you say leave it there and then go to another table, see what they've written, check off any you agree with, and maybe add some more. Because again, people are really into this, and so they'll keep thinking of things when they see another group's sheet. This activity is called stations. I'd move them maybe 2 or 3 more times. 4 to 5 is about all you can get out of a stations activity. But collect up all that data. Well, first of all, debrief it. What was the impact? Here's what we're going to do with the data. And then get a small group to analyze the data, melt it down, condense it down to a recommended set of principles of community, send that out so everybody looks at it, as I've said, get feedback, and then create a final version that is then infused into everything I've just mentioned. Each leader needs to then take that and use it to negotiate. How are we going to engage in this unit? How are we going to deal when some of us cross the line? How do we want to create our own commitment here? These are just some of mine, and again, the list could be much longer, but create inclusion, interrupt, create programs and policies, and continually keep learning. These are just some that we want people to be doing and how we engage and develop as a team. So if you do all this training, building capacity, you get those infrastructures going, then you're better positioned to move leaders and the culture into phase 3, which is infuse equity, inclusion in everything we do. And that's where people are expected to use the lenses, the trifocals. Treat everybody with dignity, but recognize all the group dynamics, microaggressions, interrupt them, and change the organization in everything you do. And this is what stage 5 looks like in the MCOD model. And it's an ongoing development, as you remember. You try new things, you test them out, you evaluate, oop, that was a mistake, you try more things, you revise, you keep going, and you expect everybody to be dismantling oppression, dismantling uninclusive dynamics wherever they see it. And if you are feeling like you're treading water because I'm moving so deep and fast, you may want to look back at my earlier webinars. First one was on dismantling racism. That will really help people understand what are at the group level, the dynamics and systems level, and what they need to be doing as individual people in privileged identities. I talked about racism, but you can listen to it, breadth of differences from any privileged identity. Second webinar was on microaggressions. And so if you don't think your organization is deep there, you can go back and look at that. You can always purchase the virtual institutes and run the workshops, but they have to get the group level and organizational level, which we've been doing the last 2. And so people have to have a toolkit to demonstrate pervasively. And the tools I want to sit on now and focus on is how do you revise and analyze all these policies, practices, programs, and services with an equity, social justice lens, and inclusion lens. The first step is you got to collect them all. And so that could be what your unit change team does, which inclusion practitioner does with the top 2 levels of leadership maybe. Collect them up. Work with HR to start collecting up. And you can collect up, and while you're collecting them up, you can just train everybody to do this. You could literally take these 6 topics, put it onto every agenda, so that before anybody makes any decision, you stop and you ask, do we have the full breadth of people at the table? If we don't, And even if we do, have we gotten input? Because just because you are doesn't mean you understand. Just because I'm a lesbian doesn't mean I understand all the LGB, much less T dynamics, and we lump everything together, LGBT, doesn't mean one person representing. So what data have we considered, and what input do we need that we've missed? Might our unconscious biases and assumptions be playing out? Slow down to think that. If we move forward with this decision, what could be the impact across group membership? Who does it advantage or meet their needs of? Who might it disadvantage, not meet their needs? And before we decide, can we make this process any more inclusive, this program, are we forgetting anything? So at a minimum, have this literally on every, I'd put it on every wall, but have it on all the agendas. Teach people to ask these questions and practice to do it. But I would actually at every meeting assign someone. Now, it could be inclusion practitioners if you have those, but you can also rotate it. That you have somebody in every meeting with these questions in front of them, that as we're doing the discussions, they're asking these questions. And if you rotate that every meeting, in 6 months, hopefully, people will be doing this naturally. It's free professional development. But I want to recommend that actually you look at the back of your packet and just pull out those group identity cards. Because you can use an inclusion lens to identify any unintended negative impact that's impacting people in marginalized groups. That's the intent. And you want to be able to explore the intent of an idea. This is how you engage the resistance. And so someone says, let's do X. Let's have the bereavement policy. Okay, great. 4 hours paid leave, but only for immediate family, right? What's the intent of that? Well, we don't have a lot of money. We can't everybody go. So engage the resistance by what's the intent, and then by group membership, what could be the unintended negative impact, and have people sit and talk about that. Now, as they're looking at the group identity cards, you'll see there might be identities people never would have thought of. And so I would make those cards, you just print them off on stock paper. Doesn't have to be, but they last longer. Do not use green, because then you'll say grab the green cards and you'll have an unintended impact. And so any other color is fine so long as you still read it. Cut them, fasten them, rubber band, make hundreds of these so you have them available, everybody can use them. But if you only have one in your bag and you're in a meeting, you just pull them out, put them on the table, face up, and ask those questions. By group membership, full breadth of differences. If you don't have the cards with you, you can brainstorm the differences in your organization and who's you serve on a chart. And you say, with all these identities and also intersecting identities, by group membership, who's impacted? And so as you're training people, you can use my ideas or take it right from what their practices are. You could have people write down a program or a service policy that you think could be relooked at anonymously, fold them, trade them 5 times, read them into the room and choose one, and then have people say by group membership whose needs are met and whose aren't. So just for the moment, if your hiring process, candidates are required to report their salary history. I'm looking at number 2. If that's your practice in HR, and if that's your practice as a hiring manager and interviewer, by group membership, who does that put at a disadvantage and keep the pay gaps going? And you can have that conversation. Or one I'm liking people to talk about is number 1, because I never would have thought of this unless someone had told me about it a few months ago. In interviews, I'm a relative extrovert when I'm around people. And so you ask me a question, I'm pretty quick and thinking about answers, and I'm also pretty prepared. There are a number of group memberships that, in fact, are at a huge disadvantage if you do not also give, we're going to be asking you these 12 questions. They don't see them ahead of time necessarily, but in the room. And so just think for a moment, by group membership, who's at a real disadvantage? And you'll come up with a number of group identities. Having this conversation can be really powerful to train people. It's that deep professional development. How do you analyze every policy, practice, and service? In stage 3, you want to get that to as many layers of the organization as you can and individual contributors, because they're going to be on committees, they're going to be interacting with clients, and they need to be in a second realizing that this process that they're required to use does not meet the needs of the person right in front of them, and they need the capacity and the permission and the power and authority to change it in the moment. And that's what's called, real quick, So I mentioned, after you teach it, then have them come up with some more and apply it. What could be improved? And back in the unit change team, leaders can be doing this in their organizations. I think every meeting, looking at a policy every meeting just for 6 months so that people get going doing it. So really quick, actually you don't have time, but to crack myself up, draw a process map of a tuna fish sandwich. This is what I do when I train folk about this next set of skills. Very advanced, but if you're looking at change teams, top leaders, as well as inclusion practitioners, you want to teach this concept of discretionary points. So just imagine if you had 8 people in a room and they all drew a tuna fish sandwich, what do you think would happen? I've done this with scores of people in the room, and I get them up and get them moving around. People just start laughing because they have their tuna fish sandwich, literally just a minute. And they're moving around and they're realizing no one's looks the same. Somebody literally 2 days ago who's from a country other than the US said, so Kathy, love the activity, and there are a lot of folks who may not eat tuna fish, who are from another country that may not even know what you're talking about because that's not the food. And I'm like, oh, they might conceptually know, but they may never have made a sandwich. So even in my inclusive activity, I need to be more paying attention. So I use this as an icebreaker because by now people are overwhelmed, exhausted when they're working with me, to get to this concept of discretionary points. LCY Cross Associates, particularly Carol Brantley, Delight Frost, Barbara Riley, were key mentors of mine. And this concept of, in any practice, even if it's written really clearly, when human beings start to implement it, i.e. a tuna fish sandwich, they might do different things and add relish or not, or mustard or egg to it. And other people are like, no, that's not how you do it. But if you don't write it down and hold people accountable, there are all these points that people could, with their discretion, if they're not paying attention, do something, or if they have some bias, do it differently, or in kind of an arrogance, like, I'm just not doing it. Your policy for hiring might say, you need to hire in place, you need to advertise in places that historically people in different marginalized identity, particularly by race and class, might be paying attention to, and not just this. And you need to be putting in print as well as online. So you might have all kinds of policies. You might even say you can't post a job description until HR sees where you're going to advertise. But if your organization doesn't enforce that, then people might be doing all kinds of things. Discretionary point mapping can get an organization to get clear what's really going on, where do we need it to be, and find those points of discretion that people are misusing and clean them up a bit. What you want to be able to do is find these answers. So real quick how I do it, say on hiring. There was an organization I worked with, had 7 leaders, happened to be a residence life organization at university. And they said, oh, we have a really good hiring practice. I'm like, great. And so I said, let's chart it. And so we charted it. And it took 20 minutes or so. And I assigned a few people to each section of the process. And they charted, and then they looked at each other's section and added. And then we stepped back and I said, so is this the current practice? And they're like, yeah. Oh, wait, no, there's one more. And so I just let them sit with it. Is this what people currently do? Yep. I said, great. And I said, are there any points of discretion where if someone used their own judgment or had a preference for doing it a certain way, that bias could come in? And they're like, oh. And then so they started to circle them. I'm like, great. And these could be opportunities where people could take an action, or they fail to take an action, or place they make a decision. And then, to be honest, what I did was I sent them home with, and you have this in your packet, it's about 18 pages of an A to Z selection processes. It's not complete, but it's not bad. And it's about 8 or 10 years old, so I appreciate any grace you'll give me. And I think I wrote it for higher ed, so there still might be a little bit of a bias there. But then I sent them home to read that and to see, is there 1 or 2 ideas that might help us at any of these discretionary points? Well, they came back in and they were like, oh, what we did was fine, but there's so much more. I said, all right, grab a marker. And I had them go up and change the practices based on what they had read. So here's what happened. They analyzed their current practice by mapping it out. They looked for discretionary points where somebody could, without thinking, or if they were wanting to, undermine the process for hiring a racially diverse, culturally competent staff leadership. Had them look at good practices and then re-look at what else they wanted to add. Now, my list of hiring practices is not the be-all and end-all. But what I have people do is look at what's already in place, what could be useful to add, just like I did. And you can do the exact same thing. Because it's like 18 pages, I give everybody like 3 or 4 to read, and then put them in groups of 4 to share. Reading all 18, I think, can be overwhelming. Though, inclusion change teams, inclusion practitioners, I have them read it before and then come in so they read it all. But that's what we're trying to do. Have them read it and be ready to share, and then put the pieces together and what else is possible. You can do the same thing with onboarding, with or without the handout that I have. I have 3 pages somewhere in there. What's already in place, what's useful to add, innovative possibilities. But don't just use my materials. Inclusion change teams, inclusion practitioners, leaders, send them out to talk to their peer institutions, people they know other places, different industries, find out what they're doing. I have what I like, but there's so much more out there, good practices, so send them out and then come back and share them. One other way that at phase 3, you can get people every day, every moment to infusing equity inclusion to everything they do. And it builds up an entire team. So let's say you're a director and there's an inclusion practitioner for your supervisor, but they're not really available too often. And you don't have the resources yet to have one of your own, so you need to build capacity. Foundational training, you can teach them any of these skills, and then this. Take the group identity cards, give everybody a pack, and then say, everybody choose one identity for the week. Anyone you want to look at. You can be in the privileged or marginalized. Again, they have to have foundations to be able to do this activity without too much resistance. And then say, for the next week, I want you, and actually, why don't you get into pairs? And so let's say one pair, one said they wanted to look at gender identity, one wanted to look at age. So in that pair, they're going to look at both of those. And that's going to be their lens, that they're going to look at everything that area does. So office decorations and art, every pamphlet, paper material you have, anything virtual, anything about programs and services, your website, intra-website as well as external, how the office is set up, size of rooms, how people have to move around. And even while they're looking at this point, gender identity, and they're looking at age, I would also just keep this here, because looking at around issues of people with disabilities and people for whom English is their second or third language, it's not their primary or proficient language. Someone just gave me that proficient language, I think, but I could be wrong. There was a new term just 3 days ago, so I'm bumbling a bit. Everybody does that. And then you come back to a staff meeting, everybody has a few minutes to share. And if they can bring show and tell, they can bring snapshots or pictures of what they saw and ideas for change. And so you do that, and maybe then you say, great, now choose a different identity. Now there's so many identities that maybe you do 12 for the first week, and then you do 12 for the second week, and everybody chooses one, a different pair, go out, scan, and then come back. Could be really powerful. Again, free professional development. They're getting group membership and organizational dynamics at the same time. Now, one more thing to get people really looking at equity inclusion would be for the leader to say, I want you all to watch me and scan me. For the next week or two, I want you to pay attention to everything I do. And maybe take these same group identity cards. You can do them all or pick several. And given how I show up, what would you think I care about, and where's my commitment? And so watch me in meetings, come look in my office, follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, print, whatever they do. Watch me anytime you see me around organization, whenever I'm talking informally or formally, emails, anything I'm putting out, a report. Just watch me for 2 weeks, and then I want feedback. And if you're willing to give it to me publicly, or maybe in the meeting, you have people write it down, fold it up, trade it, and then everybody reads it aloud. You still can know handwriting, so maybe don't have the leader read, and then somebody takes that. Depends how much fear there is, but they can also set up an anonymous way. But the bravery to say, as a leader, I want to have a conversation about what you see me doing and not doing, because I'm asking you to infuse equity inclusion in everything you do, and it starts with me. And so give me some feedback, and then maybe somebody else will say, I'm next. Watch me for the next week. Now, you don't have to do this with everybody, because not everybody may want that, but I think it's a really nice practice. So I just want to encourage you to consider that. Shifting everyone's individual behavior is critical. It's not sufficient. You have to shift the culture. And to do that, you have to identify what is our dominant culture. Now, dominant culture, it's the way we say things are, the way you have to do things, and if you do it differently, you're degraded. Now, that's different from if people are doing something that's really counter to our core values, right? And this is really, really advanced. So if you're not able to follow, I'll show some steps you can follow, and your people may not be ready for this, but I would not have felt good if I didn't talk about how do you shift exclusionary white cultural practices, because I want to focus on white culture now. Your culture might be a male normative culture. It may be really upper middle class culture, and it might be all of these. It might have a real Christian cultural to it. It may have a real ableist culture, heterosexist normative. What I want to do is use white culture as a way to think about it. And to be honest, white culture is pretty consistent with some of these others. If you don't know Tema Okun, O-K-U-N, work, you just Google that name and white supremacy culture. Now, the name may be a trigger for your inclusion change team, your leaders, and I think they need to get over it, but that's just me. That's the language they're using. And so I really highly recommend you get all leaders to read this, because what they talk about are pervasive norms that seemed, when I read this first, I'm like, well, of course you got to be a perfectionist, and urgency is important, and, you know, be an individual, and, you know, written words important. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Now let me think about this. What I love about their work in Change Work, that's the organization, is they also give you anecdotes. So when they say, part of this dominant culture is quantity of work over quality, what's the anecdote of that? Instead of either or thinking, what's the anecdote, which is both and thinking, and let's find the middle way. Instead of a right to comfort, actually, for us to learn and grow, we have to be uncomfortable. And I'm not saying 0 to 10, a 10 uncomfortable, but a 3/4 sometimes, maybe 5, 6, because we really want to look honestly at our organization. Then we have to get honest about what's going on, and we may not feel comfortable because you might get feedback about your behavior. So this might be very advanced training for your inclusion practitioners, your leaders, but to really look at, how many of these really reflect the way we operate. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that any of these in and of themselves are always wrong or ineffective. It's when it's held as the only way to be, and anybody else with another way is less than defective, and they're pushed aside or marginalized. That's the problem. And so if I'm a leader and urgency is needed, and I always interrupt, and I always make you stop what you're doing, and I change direction all the time to meet my needs as the leader, that may or may not be useful to the high performance of the entire group. There are times that some of these can be useful. And so to teach this, you may want to have people read the article, reflect on it a bit, and then in small groups, what's 1-2 ways an aspect might be useful at times, and what could be unproductive much of the time. So for instance, I literally sent out an email last week, very important meeting, short time frame to get ready for the meeting, and I had the time zones wrong. I was mixing myself all up. A colleague of mine that has, as she said, because we laughed about it, high perfectionism at the individual level and a high sense of urgency, quickly emailed me and said, I know I'm kind of anal retentive, she said, but here was a mistake. I don't know if it matters. Well, I was so grateful for some characteristics of the white supremacy culture, according to Tema Okun from Change Work. And in that moment, it was incredibly useful. But most of the time, I believe these characteristics, if they're the only way you can move forward, are not useful if you can't challenge them in the moment. So you're at a crossroads most of the time. You're in a place, am I going to stay with the way things are, status quo, what seems easier, or am I going to go what looks harder? Phase 2, increase capacity of everybody, and then phase 3, infuse it in everything we do, ongoing development, and the MCOD model, stage 5, trying to get everybody to redefining, we just keep going. So we're going to stay stuck in colluding, exclusion club, compliance, maybe even affirming, or we're truly going to organize, empower, mobilize energy, resources, people to move to stage 5. I believe it's time for a change, and has been for decades and centuries. Your customers deserve more, employees deserve more, your mission and values demand more, and the context of our national and international environment require us to do more. You don't have to have it all figured out to move forward. Arthur Ashe said, you start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can, but you just keep moving. But if you do what you've always done, you'll get the results you've always gotten. And remember, as leaders particularly, action expresses priority. So if you're abandoning other people, abdicating responsibility to the senior diversity officer, the change team, you're going to stay stuck in the muck really quick. Leaders have to be held accountable, many layers of leaders, as we're skilling everybody up, and they need to be held accountable. Those who move mountains begin by carrying small stones, Confucius. Too many times people get excited and they're like, what big thing can we do to show people we're moving? Well, actually, you get hundreds, if not thousands of people in your organization, everybody skilled up doing small changes. So you get thousands of small changes. That's what creates change that stays in there. Every small change has a huger impact. We have to get people all doing it. We're always under construction, giving people the permission. It's lifelong learning, continuous improvement. It's a process. It takes time. You have to have resilience. And when there's resistance, you just can't stop. You're going to make mistakes. No matter how far down the road you've gone in the wrong direction, you can always turn around, acknowledge it, and say, we apologize. This wasn't working out. We're going to collect some feedback. We're going to not take too long, but we're going to re-figure this out. If you want input, let us know, and we want to hear you. And just because a few people say this is wrong out of their privileged identities, let me be clear, if they're coming from their marginalized identities, I listen much sooner, much faster, even if it's just one person. But if they're coming out of their privileged identities and out of resistance, too many organizations go, oh, we're making people upset. I'm like, that people are going to be uncomfortable. So engage in the dialogue, maybe get some more conversations, some more training. But if you stop, people are not going to believe you're serious about this probably for another 10 or 15 years. Once you get the ball rolling, you've got to keep going, or you're really going to, it's going to take so much. So when you make a mistake, make amends, apologize, learn from them, infuse the lessons, but make a commitment to be proactive and anticipate errors by noticing what other people are doing in other organizations and learn from them. As you're working with leaders, you may want to end some of the training sessions to remind them what the compelling reasons are, and not you tell them, but have them write down 4 to 6 compelling reasons why we need to create equitable, inclusive social justice work environments, policies, programs, and we have to accelerate our capacity to do it and have them share it because they have to be committed for the long haul. Now, given all we've covered, you might be going, what's next? Where do we start? I want to just highlight a few and then close, and then I'll open up for some questions. This isn't everything, but most organizations, if you're at a 2 or 3, you should start with clarifying multicultural competencies expected of leaders and everybody, and have those reflected in accountability. And then really move on to assess the current state. And this doesn't have to necessarily be in this order. You can start assessing the current state, which might say to you, what are the competencies we need? So if you come from the pain points, therefore, what do we need? And then that shared vision, evidence-based diagnosis, and don't move too quickly. Several top layers of leaders, inclusion change team, inclusion practitioners, even if they're not all prepared yet, get together, dialogue, share diagnosis, and then really invest in that professional development. Again, we'll be doing that in June and July. Authentic conversation about the current state. Get lots of people looking at promising practices, revising policies and programs and services based on assessment, and then continuous improvement. If that looks like an easy roadmap, it may not always be easy, but that's a pretty good roadmap. Take a deep breath. You always have lots of resources. You can always get mine again in the front of your packet. You can have people doing book clubs, all my different workshops. Handouts here are also available in these books. The Virtual Institute is coming up. If this got your attention and you realized, it's a lot. I want to bring together some leaders and change agents, maybe an inclusion change team for us to do the work. I will slow this down into a very engaging 3 hours. I lead the workshop, and I'll add a few more topics about, a little bit more about engaging resistance and some time to look at next steps. And then if you want some of these foundational skills and tools about equity inclusion, the next 2 months, that work will be focused on that. I hope you'll join for the next Q&A on May 24th. I know it's before in this country what we do Memorial Day. It's a Thursday before. Again, we'll tape it, but whatever questions you type right now, I'll always answer there. And if you get on board, I'll answer you all first. If you have any more questions in the chat room, please add them while we still are finishing up with our few minutes. Want to highlight a couple more professional development opportunities. If, as you listen to me, you're like, you want to work more in depth, I have an ongoing masterclass for inclusion practitioners, those 64 capacities in a 12-week course. I'm training people to get much deeper capacity in those and to be able to train people and others. I'm not training trainers, but if they're already facilitators, they'll get lots of resources. And you can email me or just go to this link and you can sign up right now. The next session is tomorrow on Friday. The Year of Transformation. If you want to do what I do, know what I know, and be able to develop true transformation as a leader or a change agent organization, I have a 12-month program where I work with people in a certification program, and I'm opening it up in the next month for about 5 or 6 more folks to join. I already have 3 or 4 interested. And finally, I work with a few organizations in very comprehensive professional development. And so if you'd like some long-term work, because we've got to get people to realize this is a new normal. Let go or be dragged. I love this Zen proverb. You give them clear expectations. You do training. Get people skilled to hold people accountable with coaching. And then you say, we'll give you this much time to develop. We want to see progressive change. But if we don't start seeing it, we're going to start saying you need to start changing faster. And if you aren't willing to get on board, then we may help you move faster, but it's going to be moving out of this organization. You must be willing to let people go if you want significant organizational change. And take one final deep breath. I love this Talmud. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You're not obligated to complete the work in your lifetime, but neither are you free to abandon it. You're not obligated to complete all the work that there is to do. I was feeling overwhelmed last night and today on Facebook and on the news. There was so much. But I can do my part and do it the best of my ability and keep going. I'm not free to abandon it. With that, I hope today you got a number of ideas of next steps and infrastructure. And with that, Catherine, why don't we open it up for a good 10, 15 minutes of Q&A.
All right, we have 2 questions that came in during, like while you were talking, but if anybody else has any questions, feel free to type them in. Again, we'll cover what we can in the next few minutes, and then we have the additional full hour of question and answer happening on the 24th. All right, so the first one is actually more about your programs. We had someone ask when you will be having another in-person Train the Trainer workshop.
So I'm willing to do those if you want to organize it. And so whether it's a regional one, I may do one in Denver where I am. I just haven't quite figured that out yet. And so if you're interested, just email me and we might be able to talk. I'm willing to travel places. I just need people to organize, help collect whatever we decide to charge. If you want to hire me to do it, and then we bring in people from the whole area region and you collect resources, whatever you want to do. Minimum of a 2-day with pre-work and post-work.
All right, the next question we have is, Kathy, with regard to building the teams, I am assuming that the members of these teams are carrying out these roles in addition to their other job responsibilities. Have you had any success in getting senior leaders to recognize and value, quote unquote, reward these additional responsibilities? In other words, shifting the expectation away from diversity being a volunteer effort, but rather a specific, highly qualified skill set.
I've seen organizations that realize they need more focused diversity, equity, inclusion folks. They might add an assistant director of training. They may bring in somebody to be coordinating inclusion practitioners. The things I mentioned, an extra $1,000 a year, $1,500 a year to go to another conference, or however you want to use a professional development. Access to leaders, so meeting with the president twice a year over dinner. So there might be some ways that may not cost as much money, but get lots of career development opportunities moving. one place, train the trainers, they had a small stipend. Well, to some people it might be large. It was like $150 for a 3-hour session. These were both universities, but they both had some stipend. It was still considered part of their job, and there was some recognition. That's all that I know. Inclusion practitioners, I think there's been some experience where you've shifted 10 to 20, maybe 10% of your job to somebody else, so that opened up time. And being an inclusion practitioner is a full-time job. And I wish I had better answers. One other thought. LCY Cross worked with Wachovia Bank before they were bought out. And they worked with people that were in already an organizational development role. So this was a 100,000 employee organization. So they already were in human resources, OD people. They took those folks, deepened their capacity to be inclusion change agents. So it was already part of their job. They just expanded it. And by then, that was like a 40-day training they went through. Then it got cut to 20 days. I'm just saying, we don't have those resources too much anymore. All right, what else you got?
Kathy, do you ever talk about any specific leadership styles that are conducive to equity and inclusion work? Example, not everyone is a transformational leader, but how do we ensure that all leadership styles can incorporate these competencies?
Okay. It might be interesting, when I'm not moving so fast and you have time, to take that self-assessment for inclusion practitioners and see how many of those you go, I want my leaders doing it. The other place to look, if you remember from part 1, and I think I put it in this packet as well if you missed part 1, the indicators of stage 5, what a leader would be doing at stage 5. And so I don't have a particular author or a type of leadership style. I'm looking at the behaviors that I want them to do. And to be honest, I like that strategy. Well, I don't know anymore. When I did teach leadership, all I read was white, heterosexual, cisgender, Christian, probably upper middle class, able-bodied guys, right? So I haven't taught leadership like that in a while. So if you truly are bringing in a diverse perspectives of authors and they're talking about inclusive social justice leadership and what that looks like, that would be my best place to send you. If you don't like this idea of what are the behaviors we want leaders to do. And you can collect that up from folks. You can bring in all your different change agents you already have and some of your leaders that are pretty sharp and have just a 2-hour lunch, feed them and say, what are the leadership skills you want leaders to be doing? And you can look at my materials and have them review or look at anything else. Small groups, chart, brainstorm, move around to stations. That would be my best thinking. And again, I don't know what you mean by transformational leader. What I'm talking about is a transformational leader. Equity, inclusion, social justice, high-performing team, high-performing organization, serving the people we're supposed to be serving, effectively doing it. That's what I mean.
All right, it looks like this might be our last question. Do you have any general suggestions for development and implementing these initiatives with a focus on racial justice without contributing to the idea that other forms of oppression are not as valuable?
That is such the trap that we whites set up. Is that as soon as we start talking about race, a lot of whites will say, yeah, but what about LGBT? What about disability? What about? So, in many organizations, the pain points are so focused on racism. So I would look at your data quickly and to be able to say, we reviewed the last several surveys we've done of employees and customers, and we have issues in a number of areas. There is a bell curve of where the most are. I might be using the wrong metaphor here, and that's race and racism. And so we're going to start there. Doesn't mean we're not going to have an intersectional approach, and it doesn't mean we're going to stop here. But you can say many organizations that try to only do breadth and start there and are changing policies about every identity, we can lose energy. So why don't we start with race, help develop people's capacity, breadth of difference, the same capacities in the foundation. So I would still do foundational training. Breadth of differences, but then say we're going to start looking at everything with a racial justice lens. And what do we mean by racial justice? And what are expectations for whites in the organization? And what are expectations for folks of color in the organization? and what are our expectations for policies and programs and services. And we're going to start here and do this for at least 6 months, then keep doing it, but then we may add another. And the challenge is to keep race-centered and focused. If you're doing then sexism next, then you're making sure you're not just doing white women, but you're doing all women across all racialized identities, all gender identities, all sexualities, all disability statuses. So you keep, that's what I would suggest. I might even say, if you look at the national context, the demand for us to be much more effective around race and racism, it's just such a critical need. So we're going to start here and then build. Because here's the thing. We do the Social Justice Training Institute. Jamie Washington, Vernon Wall, Mara Cullen, I started it. Now Becky Martinez has joined us. We use race and racism as a lens. It's a 5-day intensive, very deep professional development, personal change time. And first 3 days we're immersed in racism, looking deep laboratory, real time. And then the last day and a half we pull out of it. Well, you're never done, but we just kind of keep moving to say, now what did we learn as we looked at race and racism, privileged, marginalized, that we can apply to other areas of difference. And so the similar dynamic of start with race and racism, racial justice work, and then intentionally be asking, what are we learning about privilege and marginalization that we can apply? Have that conversation and then move into the next one. People are asking, can you use the materials? Of course. Please just cite particularly on MCOD and LCY Cross. So Jackson Hardeman, and make sure you're always citing their work, and LCY Cross's work as well. And if I have my name on some of my original work, I'd appreciate that as well. Someone asked the self-assessment. You know, someone 2 days ago said they'd like to use that inclusion practitioner as a 360 feedback. I think you could. I don't know if you use a Jot form or SurveyMonkey. You can figure it out. It would be great to get other people's perspective.
I think that was all we actually had for questions in here.
And I did it almost on time, and we started late.
You did a great job, even with the tech difficulties.
Even with the tech. Well, your help was very helpful. And so, again, I just want to thank everybody. I will redo this on Saturday, and then we'll send it out to everybody. We can send this one out too, Catherine, if you think people might want it sooner. But if you don't mind leaving a note to say I'm sending it out again on Saturday. Because it was pretty noisy that first 20 minutes. And we apologize for the tech and take everything as a lesson. How is this just like what's going on in your organization right now? And did we do anything to try to ameliorate, shift, run quickly to fix it? That was like, oh, we can do that too. So thank you for your work to create inclusive, socially just organizations as we're trying to create the world we envision. One person at a time, one organization at a time. All the best. See you in the future. Bye-bye.